India did something that most Indians do not know about, something that most of the world's media has not fully pieced together, because it did not happen in one place, it did not happen in one room or in one meeting, it happened in different places, in defense, in diplomacy, in border security, in international trade, completely different arenas. And when you understand all of them together, when you see the full picture rather than the individual pieces, one question becomes impossible to avoid. Is India preparing for war, or is India preparing to stop one? Stay with this video, because by the end, the answer will not just surprise you, it will change the way you see this country. For decades, there were people, and you have met them, who had a standard answer to every question about India's ambitions. India cannot project power. India is dependent on foreign oil, on foreign weapons, on foreign technology, on foreign approval. India is a country that reacts, not a country that leads. India is a country that asks, not a country that decides. And for a long time, and this is the part that requires honesty, some of that was not entirely wrong. In 1991, India was so financially distressed that it physically flew gold reserves to London as collateral for an emergency International Monetary Fund loan, because India needed cash urgently enough that it could not afford to wait. That is what strategic vulnerability looks like when it becomes personal. But something shifted, not overnight, quietly, systematically, year by year, decision by decision, investment by investment. And this month, in the May of 2026, that shift has become impossible to ignore. This video is going to cover some important moves made by India. Each of these moves deserves to be understood properly. So let us begin. Here is a fact that most people outside the defense community do not know. Until May 2025, there was a genuine global debate about whether Russia's most advanced surface-to-air missile system, the S-400 Triumph, actually worked as advertised in real combat conditions. In Iran, Russian air defense systems failed against American and Israeli airstrikes. In Venezuela, they proved largely ineffective when tested. The specifications on paper were extraordinary. The performance in war was disappointing. Defense analysts were beginning to question whether the S-400 was just an expensive showpiece, impressive at exhibitions, but unreliable when it mattered. India's Operation Sindoor answered that question. When India launched its military response to the Pahalgam terror attack in May 2025, Operation Sindoor gave India's S-400 system its most visible combat validation in South Asia. What happened in those 4 days stunned the global defense community. Multiple Pakistani aircraft were shot down, at least 5 hostile fighters, but the engagement that changed everything was one specific kill. Pakistan had sent up one of its most valuable aircraft, a high-altitude surveillance platform, the kind that sits far behind the front line and acts as the eyes and brain of the entire air operation, tracking Indian radar, monitoring Indian fighters, feeding real-time intelligence to Pakistani commanders so they always know exactly what India is doing before India knows they are watching. And then the S-400 did something that the global defense community is still talking about. It reached across 300 kilometers of open sky, using its 4ON-6 missile, a weapon that flies at Mach 14, 14 times the speed of sound, capable of engaging targets at almost any altitude and at ranges stretching up to 400 kilometers. And it found that aircraft, and it eliminated it before the Pakistani crew even had time to understand what was happening. The Pakistani aircraft was gone before it knew it was in danger. The S-400's reputation was restored in a single engagement, and India's air defense credibility was established in a way that no peacetime test, no exhibition, and no manufacturer's specification sheet could ever have accomplished. In March 2026, India's Defense Acquisition Council approved the purchase of an additional 5 regiments of S-400 systems, 10 battalions, bringing India's total planned S-400 arsenal from 10 battalions to 20, one of the largest single air defense procurement decisions made by any country in the modern era. And then on May 26, 2026, Russia's Federal Service for Military Technical Cooperation confirmed publicly what Indian defense circles had already known. India has formally expressed interest in an additional batch of S-400 systems beyond even that current expanded order. Russia is ready to deliver, and formal negotiations are actively underway. So the question is, why does India need more? Because China is about to give Pakistan something that changes the air warfare equation entirely. China's J-35 is a fifth-generation stealth fighter jet, designed from the ground up to be invisible to radar, designed specifically to penetrate air defense systems like the ones India currently operates. And its export variant is now finalized, with Pakistan among the first expected recipients. India does not yet have a fifth-generation fighter of its own, and the AMCA, India's Advanced Medium Combat Aircraft, is still years away from operational deployment. But India's answer to a Pakistani stealth fighter is not to rush the development of its own stealth aircraft. India's answer is to make stealth itself irrelevant. The J-35 is designed to defeat radar. India is building a system where, even when the radar is partially defeated, something else in the network picks up the target and the kill happens anyway. And there is one more layer to this story that most commentators miss entirely. When Turkey bought the S-400, the United States imposed CAATSA sanctions, heavy, painful, diplomatically damaging sanctions that cost Turkey enormously. When China bought the S-400, the same result followed. Both countries paid a serious price for that purchase. India bought the S-400 and received a special waiver from Washington during Donald Trump's first term. No sanctions, no penalties, full delivery permitted without consequence. That waiver was not given out of generosity or friendship. It was given because the United States made a cold strategic calculation that punishing India for a sovereign defense decision would cost America far more in terms of the broader relationship than the principle of enforcing the sanctions was worth, because India was simply too important to America's strategic interests in Asia to be pressured over a weapons purchase. India is now buying significantly more S-400 systems, and the same calculation applies, and the same result will follow. Now the story moves to the Mediterranean, because one of India's most calculated moves happened not in Asia, but on a small island in the eastern Mediterranean, aimed at a country that has been quietly working against India for years. That country is Turkey. Turkey and India do not have a hostile relationship in any formal sense. There is no war, no official confrontation, no active military standoff. But Turkey has been quietly, persistently, and deliberately working against Indian interests for years, raising the Kashmir issue at the United Nations, consistently supplying Pakistan with military hardware, including Bayraktar TB2 drones and Songar drones, and during Operation Sindoor in May 2025, Pakistani forces used those Turkish-made drones to attack Indian civilian and military installations. India shot every single one of them down. Turkey's drone industry, which had been celebrated globally as a revolutionary force that had changed the nature of warfare in Ukraine and Libya, took a reputational hit of historic proportions in 4 days of Indian combat, dismantling a mythology that billions of dollars of exports had been built on. But India did not stop at the battlefield response, because India understood something about Turkey that Turkey would very much prefer the world not think about too carefully. Turkey has one great geopolitical wound, one exposed flank, one issue that has defined its international isolation for decades. Cyprus. In 1974, Turkey invaded the northern third of the island of Cyprus, has occupied that territory ever since, and declared a separate state, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, in 1983, a declaration that every single member of the United Nations refused to recognize, leaving Turkey as the only country on earth that considers that territory a legitimate separate state, An isolation that is why Turkey remains frozen out of the European Union, despite being a NATO member, why its diplomatic relationships with the Western world are permanently complicated, and why Cyprus represents Turkey's deepest vulnerability, the issue that keeps it permanently on the defensive anytime it tries to claim moral authority anywhere. And India walked right up to that wound. Prime Minister Modi visited Cyprus, the first Indian prime minister to set foot on the island in over 2 decades, stood alongside President Nikos Christodoulides, walked the streets of historic Nicosia, and then made a gesture that was as precisely calculated as any military operation. Both leaders walked together to the United Nations ceasefire green line, the buffer zone that separates internationally recognized Cyprus from Turkish-occupied territory, with India making clear to every capital that was watching that it stands with Cyprus's sovereignty, does not recognize Turkey's occupation, and is now present physically, diplomatically, strategically, at Turkey's most sensitive geopolitical nerve. Cyprus awarded Modi the Grand Cross of the Order of Makarios III, the highest honor the island bestows on any foreign head of government. Then came May 2026, when Cyprus President Christodoulides made a state visit to New Delhi, opened a Cyprus trade office in Mumbai, met Modi at Hyderabad House, and the two countries signed a strategic partnership elevation and a 2026 to 2031 defense cooperation roadmap, the third defense agreement between the two nations since 2022, covering joint naval exercises, Indian naval vessel visits to Cypriot ports, maritime security coordination, counterterrorism intelligence sharing, and cybersecurity collaboration. And then came the detail that sent Turkish strategic circles into genuine alarm. Cyprus has officially expressed interest in purchasing BrahMos supersonic cruise missiles from India, in acquiring India's Akash air defense system, and in Indian drones, the same category of weapon that India had just proved in live combat against Pakistan that it could shoot out of the sky with ease. BrahMos, the world's fastest cruise missile, traveling at nearly 3 times the speed of sound, already deployed by the Philippines and Vietnam, and transforming the strategic calculus of those regions, potentially going to an island nation in the eastern Mediterranean, sitting adjacent to Turkish-occupied territory. The rule of this new India is simple. If you arm India's enemies, India will arm yours. But the Cyprus story does not end with Turkey. It connects to something much bigger: how India sells its goods to the rest of Europe. Now, before going further, one thing needs to be understood. Cyprus is a small island in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. Geographically, it sits closer to the Middle East than to most of Europe. But politically and legally, Cyprus is a full member of the European Union. It uses the euro. It follows EU laws. It has full access to all European markets. So for India, Cyprus is a valuable thing. A country that sits physically at the crossroads between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, while legally being a fully European nation. It is, in simple terms, the door between two worlds. And India just put its foot in that door. India and Cyprus agreed to work together on IMEC, which stands for the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor. In simple terms, it is a trade route, a path for Indian products to travel through the Middle East and reach Europe faster and cheaper than before. And connected to this, Prime Minister Modi met Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and secured something significant. Italy has a port called Trieste, the largest free port in the country, positioned at the top of the Adriatic Sea, with direct train connections running into Germany, Austria, and the rest of Central Europe. Italy agreed to make this port a key stop on India's trade route to Europe. To understand why this matters, consider what Italy was doing before this. Italy was the only G7 country, the only major Western economy, that had joined China's Belt and Road Initiative, a massive Chinese infrastructure program through which Beijing was building economic influence around the world. Italy joined in 2019. By 2023, Italy had become the first major Western nation to walk away from China's project entirely, and it walked toward India instead. Modi gave Maloney a small chocolate gift during their meeting, and it went viral. Everyone talked about the chocolate for days, but almost nobody noticed that in the same room, India had just gained a gateway to more than 17 European countries through one of the continent's most strategically positioned ports. On May 22, 2026, Home Minister Amit Shah stood before the Border Security Force and made an announcement that deserves far more attention than it has received. The Smart Border Project, a commitment to transform 6,000 kilometers of India's borders with Pakistan and Bangladesh into the most technologically advanced frontier security system in Asia. Within 1 year, not by adding more soldiers to an already stretched force and not by building higher physical walls, but by deploying technology that makes the border see everything, hear everything, and respond to everything in real time, at any hour, in any weather, through drone-based radar systems scanning kilometers of terrain from above, thermal imaging cameras for night detection, because the large majority of illegal crossings happen after dark when traditional surveillance is weakest. Ground sensors that detect footsteps and vehicle movement from hundreds of meters away, AI-enabled video analytics that can distinguish between a stray animal and a human being crossing illegally, laser fence systems, satellite monitoring, and integrated command centers that connect every single sensor input to rapid response teams who can be deployed within minutes of a detection anywhere along that 6,000-kilometer frontier. Why now with this urgency? Because the context has changed completely since Operation Sindoor. India has demonstrated that it will respond to terrorism with military force, decisively, precisely, and without waiting for international permission. And a Pakistan that knows this is a Pakistan under simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. Water pressure with India regulating river flows and the Indus Waters Treaty suspended, economic pressure from isolation, and military pressure from the most capable air defense network on its borders being actively expanded. A Pakistan under that kind of simultaneous pressure will inevitably seek asymmetric responses. More infiltration attempts, more attempts to push terrorists across the border and destabilize Indian territory through irregular means, because the regular means of Pakistani air power and missile capability have been made far too dangerous and costly to use. India is closing that option before Pakistan can use it. The Bangladesh dimension adds a different but equally important layer. Irregular migration across that border has been a persistent challenge for Assam, West Bengal, Tripura, and the northeastern states for decades. And with BJP now governing West Bengal, the state-level political obstruction that had blocked border fencing progress for years has been removed entirely. Israel's smart border around Gaza, widely regarded as the most sophisticated in the world, took years to build and covers a fraction of the distance India is attempting. The United States has spent decades and hundreds of billions of dollars on its southern border without achieving comprehensive technological coverage. India is attempting 6,000 kilometers in 12 months, and the ambition alone is a statement of confidence that the execution will then need to prove. On May 15, 2026, at the BRICS Foreign Ministers meeting held at Bharat Mandapam in New Delhi, attended by the foreign ministers of 17 nations with the global press present, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov walked to the microphone and said something that no outside power has said about India in the modern era. That if the world seeks a long-term mediator between Iran and its Arab neighbors, that role should be played by India because of India's vast diplomatic experience, and that India, as the BRICS president, directly interested in receiving oil from the region, should offer its services to invite Iran and the UAE to begin a conversation with each other to agree on how to avoid hostilities. Russia's foreign minister publicly at a global multilateral summit, nominating India as the peacemaker for the world's most dangerous active military conflict, Not the United Nations, not China, not any European power, not Russia itself, but India. The context makes this even more extraordinary. The United States and Israel had struck Iran. Iran had retaliated. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which flows roughly 50% of India's crude oil imports, 60% of its LNG, and nearly all of its LPG, was under threat, and the world was watching a confrontation between nuclear-armed and nuclear-adjacent powers with no credible mediator in sight, because Pakistan, which had been positioned as an immediate facilitator of dialogue, had just been exposed by U.S. intelligence as having quietly allowed Iranian military aircraft to shelter on Pakistani military air bases, while simultaneously claiming to broker peace. A revelation so damaging that U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham publicly demanded Pakistan be removed from any mediator role entirely, leaving a vacuum that Lavrov filled by pointing at India. Why India specifically? Because India has something no other country currently possesses in the context of this conflict: genuine, working, trusted relationships with every single party involved simultaneously, strategic ties with Iran through the Chabahar Port Project, deep relationships with the UAE and Gulf states where more than 8 million Indians live and work, a critical strategic partnership with the United States at the heart of Washington's Indo-Pacific strategy, a long-standing relationship with Russia, and a trusted partnership with Israel, one of the very few countries that Israeli strategic planners count as a genuinely non-hostile partner. No other country sits at the intersection of all of these relationships at the same time. And Russia's foreign minister, Finland's President Stubb, and Iran's own envoy to India, three independent voices from three completely different perspectives, all arrived at the same conclusion. India is the indispensable country, the country every side trusts enough to listen to, the country no conflict can be permanently resolved without, the destination that decades of principled, independent, multi-aligned foreign policy, every decision to refuse pressure, every refusal to join a bloc that would have narrowed India's options, every moment India chose its own course over the easier path of alignment with whoever was loudest, was always building toward. So finally, the answer to the question this video opened with: is India preparing for war, or is India preparing to stop one? The answer is both, simultaneously and deliberately, and that is not a contradiction. That is the definition of strategic maturity that separates great powers from all other nations. India is expanding its S-400 network because a country that can defend itself from anything is a country that never has to fight a war it cannot win. Deterrence is not aggression. Deterrence is the thing that makes aggression irrational. And when Pakistan's military command calculates what a conflict with India now costs in aircraft, in missiles, in high-value surveillance platforms that can be eliminated at 300 kilometers, the calculation changes to, we cannot win this. And when that calculation is reached before conflict begins, the conflict does not begin. India is building presence in Cyprus because a country that can project consequences into its adversary's neighborhood changes the risk calculation of that adversary permanently. Turkey helped Pakistan against India, and India is now positioned to help Cyprus against Turkey, not as war, but as deterrence through geography. The same logic that has maintained peace between great powers throughout modern history, India is sealing its borders because a country that controls who enters its territory removes one of the most effective tools its enemies have for creating internal instability without formal conflict. And India is positioning itself as a global mediator because a country that can stop wars is worth more to every party than a country that only fights them. Russia nominated India not because India is weak, but because India is trusted. Because India has built enough credibility and enough genuine relationships on enough different sides that even nations at war with each other are willing to let India into the room. War ready and peace capable. These are not opposites. The most powerful countries in history have always been both. In this week, for anyone paying close enough attention, India showed the world that it has earned the right to be called exactly that. This video is not for governments or policymakers or strategic analysts. It is for the person who was told in a foreign classroom or a condescending editorial or a dismissive comment by someone who had never visited India and never intended to, that India was not capable, that India was a developing country that needed to be guided or managed or pitied, for the Indian student abroad who was asked why India is poor, for the Indian professional treated as if their country were a charity case, for the Indian family that watched foreign commentators describe their home as a hellhole while their own children were keeping the lights on in Silicon Valley, in the NHS, in boardrooms across the world. Look at what happened this week. A country that once flew gold to London on a plane is now expanding the most combat-proven air defense system on the planet, and no foreign power can sanction it for doing so. A country that was told it could not project power beyond its own borders is now placing its strategic fingerprints on the Eastern Mediterranean, and the country that armed India's enemy is now losing sleep over what is coming next. A country whose borders were called porous and ungovernable is now building 6,000 kilometers of smart frontier technology in 12 months, more ambitious than what the United States has attempted in decades. And a country told it was merely a large, poor democracy with no real influence had Russia's foreign minister stand at a global summit and tell 17 nations, if you want this war to end, there is only one country that can make it happen. And that country is India. This did not happen because of luck or because the world suddenly became kind. It happened because of millions of decisions made by millions of people over decades. Scientists who stayed up all night, soldiers who stood in rain and snow on mountain passes, engineers who built things the world said could not be built, farmers who grew food for 1 billion people, teachers who shaped the minds now shaping the world. It happened because India kept building when the world was not watching, and now the world is watching. To every person who watches these videos, shares these stories, comes back week after week, we see you, every one of you, and you are part of why this story gets told. India is moving. We are documenting it in real time, and we are just getting started. Before we end, I want to genuinely thank everyone who takes the time to watch these videos. To everyone who comments regularly, shares their thoughts, adds perspective, and keeps these discussions alive. Thank you so much. And to everyone who chooses to spend their time here, listening, learning, questioning, and engaging with us, it truly means a lot. This channel exists because of your support, so keep watching, keep sharing, keep questioning, and stay with us for the next chapter.